The Eads Bridge. St. Louisans don't give it much thought these days, but when it opened in 1874, it was big news.
People in the city have been itching for a bridge for a long time, so when this thing is finally part of their lives, they are delighted.
The story of the Eads Bridge is a story of many firsts, including its distinction as the first all-steel structure in the world.
When Eads puts his bet on steel, he's not on the edge of the envelope, he's clinging to the edge of the envelope.
Salvaging wrecked steamboats earned James Eads a fortune. Designing ironclad gunboats, which helped the North win the Civil War, earned him gravitas. But it was his design of this bridge, the Eads Bridge, that earned him worldwide fame, even though he had no formal training as an engineer.
It's either bold or foolhardy or both, but he's not a cautious man, so he's willing to take the risk.
Author John K. Brown, who taught history, ethics, and writing at the University of Virginia, is as captivated today by the story of the bridge as the people of St. Louis were when it opened to traffic 150 years ago. His book, spanning the Gilded Age, is the story of the Eads Bridge. It is a tale of invention and risk, creativity and luck, and of a self-made, self-taught engineer whose audacious ideas profoundly changed the city of St. Louis by connecting it to the future.
The modern city of St. Louis, we owe to James Eads.
John Brown, welcome to St. Louis. I suppose I should say welcome back to St. Louis. I imagine you spent a lot of time here researching this book.
I think this is my fourth or fifth visit to St. Louis, but this time I've finally gotten to get outside a library, so I've been able to see a lot more, and I've enjoyed the trip a lot. So normally I go to the library and I go to the Eads Bridge. That's what I do. So this is fun.
Well, and you know what's interesting, and you point this out in the book, it was something that never even occurred to me before, that the name of the bridge tells a lot about the importance of the man, because there are really no other bridges that we know of, maybe one somewhere, that's named for the person who built it.
Yep. It is a really unique distinction to have the bridge named after the designer, the promoter, the financier. He had many, many hats on. It was originally called the St. Louis Bridge, but then, of course, that became a problem when a second bridge was built over the river. So in the 1890s, pretty much the name shifted over to the Eads Bridge, and it's been that way ever since.
So it opened in 1874, but it took a long time to build it. What was the bridge situation? What was the closest bridge? Up north somewhere, wasn't it?
So the first bridge over the Mississippi was at Rock Island, Illinois, finished in 1856. Then Clinton, Iowa is 1864. I can't really tell you. I think the Hannibal Bridge may have been the next one north of St. Louis. There's a map in the book that lays it all out. But certainly it was pretty far upstream. And the other challenge for building a bridge in St. Louis is it's, of all the Mississippi bridges, it was the first bridge south of the confluence with the Missouri River. So people in St. Louis know that your river here is a lot more river than what happens north in the upper Mississippi. So that upper river was easier to build. Here at St. Louis, commerce went back and forth over the river on ferries. And amazingly enough, that worked for the city. The city was the leading city of the West, even though it depended on ferries for everything to come and go. There was a lot of railroads that came just up to the river but stopped in East St. Louis, Illinois, and then all the freight and all the passengers that were coming off those trains had to get on ferries and go across the river that way.
So James Eads, Captain James Eads, was not originally from St. Louis, although he came here as a young man. But it seems like his whole life, somehow or other, gravitated toward the river.
Yes.
Who was James Eads?
Well, he is a fascinating guy, and it's tough with somebody so remarkable. You just think they're a genius. They're a man apart. But Eads was deeply curious. He was driven to see problems in a fresh light. Whatever the problem was, he was going to give you a unique perspective on it. He had great confidence in his own abilities. He dropped out of school after the 8th grade, went to work, worked in St. Louis as a clerk for some kind bosses who made sure that he had access to their libraries so he could learn a lot. So he's curious, he's hardworking, he's amazingly courageous. So in his first career, or first chapter, as I call it, of his professional life, he worked salvage on the Mississippi River. And to do that, he invented gear, including a diving bell, and he'd go out on the river and literally walk the bottom of the Mississippi River. And what he was doing was looking for the wrecks of steamboats. So in the 1840s, 1850s, steamboats are the semi-trucks of the West. So they're carrying cargoes up and down the rivers because there are no roads, very few railroads, even into the 1850s, few railroads. So steamboats are the way to go, but they don't last very long. They're made out of wood. They have these raging fires in their boilers. So the average steamboat on the western rivers in the 1850s lasted 3 years, and they blew up, they sank, they ran aground, they caught fire. So when Eads looked at all that mayhem, and he figured out a way to make some money off of it. The downside, it could be really difficult to find a wreck. So a boat that catches fire off Cairo, Illinois, it's going to sink, but you may have to look for 5 or 10 miles downstream in the muddy Mississippi to try and find whatever was left of that boat. So it was not an easy way to make money by any means, pretty hard.
But he made money, quite a bit of money.
He made scads of dough. So he made enough money so that he claimed he retired, if you will. He wasn't a guy who ever was going to sit around. But he retired from the active work of salvage at the age of 37 with what he thought was a plenty big fortune to carry him for a while.
Was it his idea to build the bridge, or did somebody come to him?
So it was his idea, but it wasn't a unique idea. So St. Louis, the leaders in St. Louis knew, really starting in the 1850s, that they really needed a bridge, and they had thought about a suspension bridge that would help wagons and people and farm animals get across. But clearly by the 1850s, it had to be a rail bridge. So after the war, by 1867, there's a network of rails, mostly to the east, 60,000 miles of track, and it's almost all east of the Mississippi. So many, many people in St. Louis knew that they needed a way to connect to that network. They were, in some ways, it's fair to say they were desperate to make that connection. So in the summer of 1867, there are 5 different ventures, all private sector ventures, trying to raise the money and get the authorizations to build a bridge, a rail bridge across the river in St. Louis. So Eads is just one of 5, which to my mind really makes his success even more impressive.
Well, and it was also another one of his skills was creative financing, and there was a lot of it on this bridge.
There was a lot in this bridge. So today we think of bridges as a kind of infrastructure that we look to government to build. At that point in time, governments didn't mostly do this kind of thing. So city governments were generally seen as too weak or incompetent or corrupt to undertake this kind of massive infrastructure project. So furthermore, the leaders of these cities, typically, whether they're political leaders or business leaders, they don't want to turn these possibilities, these opportunities over to government. They'd like to build them themselves and make a profit off of it. So for those reasons, city gas works, street railways, bridges, waterworks all tended to be privately financed. And as you say, Eads had some real advantages in having a real skill in finance. He was very, very good at it. He could tell a really compelling tale about why you should put money on him.
As you said, there was a competition to build the bridge. His design, which obviously won, was inspired, I think, by a bridge he saw on vacation?
Yes. So I love this. So Eads has this habit of working really, really hard and then working so hard that he kind of collapses and he can't do much for a period of time. So he needs to take a vacation. He takes his wife, and they go across the Atlantic, and they tour Europe. And he's literally on a river cruise on the Rhine, and they pass by this brand new bridge at a place called Koblenz in Prussia. And it's a lovely, graceful bridge of 3 arches, and Eads sees that, and that one at Koblenz, it did carry railroads. And Eads is inspired by this vision, and it's in his mind when he's crossing back to America that, gee, maybe he could bring this to St. Louis. But the real impetus for why he's thinking of a bridge in St. Louis, by that point, he's starting to invest his money in Western railroads. So these are lines that would leave St. Louis, head west, maybe if they're really, really playing their cards right, get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So those lines, which he's putting a lot of money into, are clearly going to succeed a lot better if there's a rail connection over the river to link up with the east. So that's the original motive he has in turning to thinking about a bridge for St. Louis.
There are a lot of innovations associated with this bridge, from what he did with the caissons to get into the bedrock to the steel. It was really the first steel structure in America, right?
It was literally the first structure of any kind to rely on structural steel, not just in America, but in the world at large. Steel was quite rare at that point. When Eads commits to steel for the bridge, that's a month after the very first Bessemer works in the United States does its first production. So Bessemer was an Englishman. Bessemer steel was pretty widespread in England in the 1850s even. But Bessemer steel was so new, even in Britain, and its output was so unreliable that the British Board of Trade, part of the government, would not allow the use of steel in bridges in Britain until 1876. So when Eads puts his bet on steel, he is really out. He's not on the edge of the envelope. He's clinging to the edge of the envelope. And it's as I think of it, as it's either bold or foolhardy or both. But he's not a cautious man, so he's willing to take the risk.
So steel is at the top. Let's go down below to the bottom and talk about these caissons. How in the world did they get down to bedrock in the middle of the river to build their way up?
Right. So of course they have to start with the foundations of the bridge, the piers and the abutments that we see to the present day. So that's the starting point. You're not going to do anything with steel and a superstructure until you have all that stonework in place. So, and Eads knew the river. He knew it well. And so that started him out thinking that he wanted to put very few piers in the river. So the piers are what hold the bridge up. So other designers weren't so worried about the piers, but Eads was focused entirely on the piers, and he decided he needed just 2 of them. And that would mean he'd have very long span lengths. And that because he'd have long spans, that's why he wanted steel. So he wants only 2 piers in the river. He wants them out of stone, and he wants them all the way down to bedrock. So he had some initial ideas about how to do that, which frankly I don't think were very practical. So when he learns about a European method to build piers down to bedrock, he seizes on it. In fact, he goes over to Europe to learn about it. He sees it in use. This is a method developed by English and French engineers. And this is part of what I love about the guy. He doesn't speak a word of French, but he goes over to France. He takes in a St. Louis friend who is fluent, and he gets the French engineers to explain everything to him. So then he comes back, and he's going to use caissons. Now, for caissons, imagine a big box, kind of like a shoe box, but upside down. So you've got a solid, flat top, but no bottom. So Eads used iron for his caissons. He had them made at a shipyard in Carondelet. Do I say that right, or do I say Carondelet?
We say Carondelet. It should be Carondelet. But
Carondelet. So he had them made in that shipyard, and they were then hauled up into place where he wanted a pier to grow in the river. So you have this thing that is floating in the river. It's held into place by wooden pilings driven into the sandy riverbed by a pile driver. So it's now pinned exactly where he wants to build his pier, and it's floating there. So next they bring these, what he called pontoon boats, and he designed all of their equipment. And these are boats that have the core piece of equipment is that each pontoon boat has 5 cranes that are on the boat. They kind of look like modern tower cranes that we build, skyscrapers with. But these cranes each had a crane operator. So they're tied up to the caisson on either side. Then tugboats start bringing barges of cut stone out to the pontoon boat. On the pontoon boat, the crane operator can use his crane to pluck a 7-ton piece of stone off of the barge, carry it right over the pontoon boat, and place it on the caisson. Now, every time he does that, that's building some of the component of the pier, and it's adding weight to the caisson, forcing the caisson down. So pretty soon, the masons who are working on top of the caisson, they've got a developing stone pier building away. And as the caisson can't move, remember, it's still held in place by those wooden pilings, so it keeps going down slowly, deeper and deeper, and eventually it hits that sandy riverbed. So the masons are going to keep working, but now the focus shifts. So now it's time to start excavations down inside the caisson. So when they were building the pier, part of the design was that there's a circular iron staircase built right inside the stone pier. There's also water and air lines built inside the pier. So, and in the caisson, there's an airlock. So once the caisson is landed there on the sandy riverbed, compressors in the pontoon boats are fired up. They expel any water that's in that caisson, and they put air under pressure in the caisson. And then pretty brave guys go down that circular staircase. They go through the airlock, and they find themselves standing on the riverbed of the Mississippi, some 40 feet down. And then they start to work to dig, to go down to bedrock. The work in the caissons was tough. At first, the guys who were digging, they were called the submarines. Those guys, in a way, at first, it's not so tough. The air pressure inside is unpleasant, but it's not more than that. The atmosphere inside's unpleasant because it's all being lit with kerosene lanterns that smoke badly. So at first, it's not so bad. And at that point, visitors could come check this out. So if you knew James Eads, you could get a pass and go down the staircase and go through the airlock and watch something that was just out of this world. And you came away with stories to tell your grandchildren, I'll tell you that. But as the depth went down, the pressure inside had to increase because they had to have more air pressure inside the caisson to keep Mississippi water from getting in. So even though the caisson is now starting really well rooted in the sand, if they didn't have that air pressure inside, the water would get inside and you wouldn't be able to work it. So air pressure, by the time they get to bedrock, the air pressure inside is 3 times the pressure at sea level. And long before that happens, the submarines are starting to feel real pains and paralysis even. It's a kind of temporary paralysis from what's called caisson disease, what they called the bends, and what we call decompression sickness. So it was tough work. Before they finished the excavations, 13 men would die. So not an easy phase in the process. Eads did know that this kind of problem was going to crop up. As it got worse, he had his own family doctor become the doctor to minister to these workers. He even had a hospital of sorts built on one of the pontoon boats so that men who were feeling badly when they came up, they could be held there in that hospital and given what kind of relief they thought would make a difference.
Well, and there was one guy, was it Theodore Cooper, was that his name, who fell off the top?
Yeah, so Theodore Cooper is a great figure in American engineering history. His career started out working for Eads, and in Cooper's case, we've got the caissons are done, the piers are done, and now they're building the superstructure. And Cooper is working really, really hard to get all that steel work to line up. So that was a whole other challenge, is when they were building the superstructure, they had the steel work coming out from the piers and the abutments, and the steel work is reaching out from each side, cantilevered, and it's getting closer and closer, and it's Cooper's job to make sure that those steel tubes link up. So one day Cooper's out on the bridge paying attention to everything, except he wasn't paying attention to where he stepped. And he tripped over a board, and he fell something like 60 feet into the river. He's an engineer, so he went back later and calculated the distance. But he fell into the river. He goes deep into the Mississippi. He comes up gasping for air, finds he's still got his pencil in his hand, and everybody watched this happen. And so the boat quickly went off and rowed off to get him. And they plucked him out of the water. He went home, got some dry clothes. He was back at work the same day. So he was lucky. There were at least 3 others, workmen, who fell during that phase of construction. They fell into the river and they died.
Along with the bridge, a lot of people don't realize, and I think I have to count myself as one of these people, even though I lived in St. Louis all my life, that there was also a tunnel associated with it, which is still there and which is still in use by the Metrolink. What was the tunnel all about?
Step away from the bridge and the tunnel for a moment. I'll answer your question, but one of the things that I marvel about Eads, he's the original systems engineer. He's not just thinking about one idea. He puts a whole galaxy of ideas together, stitches them together. So with his bridge, his main design challenge isn't the bridge. His main design challenge, as he sees it, how do I make freight and passengers move through the whole region better? Indeed, how do I make this improvement for the nation as a whole? So that's his goal. Over in East St. Louis, he figures there'll be big rail yards that will sort and forward the freight of the whole continent. Then there's the bridge, and it's got 2 decks, a road deck above and a rail deck below. And then, as you say, the traffic goes immediately into a tunnel under Washington Avenue. It was 4,400 feet long, among the longest tunnels in America when it opened. Pretty unusual to think of a tunnel that long for railroad traffic using steam engines that make a lot of smoke. But his tunnel was designed to do something, and did succeed in doing something, that was unique. In most other American cities, trains ran in the streets. Now, that was because city fathers wanted so badly to get the new thing, the railroad, to come to town. They were not going to make it difficult. Well, by 1867, when Eads is floating his plans, Americans in all of those cities are starting to see this is a hell of a bad deal, that we have trains running in our streets. In Chicago, by 1867, railroad lines are lacing the streets of Chicago, and they're killing or wounding hundreds of people a year. In New York City, the trains ran down 10th Avenue. New Yorkers found it so dangerous, they called 10th Avenue Death Alley. So Eads was trying to avoid that by putting trains off the bridge into the tunnel. They would run right under the business district, under Washington Avenue, then turn south, and then turn west and end up in the Mill Creek Valley at Chouteau's Pond, that area, where Eads also planned that there would be a big, grand Union station that would serve every railroad that came to St. Louis from any point on the compass. He didn't invent that idea, but Union stations would be rare in America until about 1900. So again, you're seeing this guy who's thinking big systems and how to help his city and his region grow. So the tunnel worked out well. If you arrived in St. Louis in the 1880s, you arrived kind of choking a bit. It did have a lot of smoke, but they then built an exhaust system to exhaust all of that. And the tunnel, you arrived in that tunnel really by rail for as long as rail passenger service lasted. And then, yes, Metrolink saw the value there and took the bridge and the tunnel and added 2 stops for downtown. So the riders today are using a technology designed by a man in 1867.
So 1874 comes along and the bridge opens. What was opening day like? That was a spectacular, and this wasn't just a national story, the bridge. It was an international story.
It certainly was. So So I opened the book with the opening day. On opening day, all of St. Louis celebrated. And you have to remember, people in the city have been itching for a bridge for a long time. So when this thing is finally part of their lives, they are delighted. And Eads and the bridge company scheduled the grand opening to fall on July 4th. So we're also celebrating the nation's birthday. So this grand parade gets assembled in the streets of downtown starting around 7 o'clock in the morning, and then it starts a march. And first they march around the city streets downtown. And the parade was a magnificent thing. It had marching bands and choral societies. It had a pony corps of kids riding ponies. It had veterans from the War of 1812. And then it goes out onto the bridge. And reporters from St. Louis estimated that the parade was 12 miles long, even at midday with the temperature 102 degrees. So they walk over the bridge. There's not much to see in Illinois, in East St. Louis, a lot of mud and rail yards. So then they come on back, but they're absolutely delighted.
Did they walk an elephant across the bridge?
They would earlier, so a few days before, well, even before that. So the bridge is basically done by May, but then it needs to go through a bunch of tests to make sure that it's safe. So the most important tests involved running fully loaded railroad locomotives back and forth over the bridge. And Eads, the bridge company, had to borrow those locomotives. They didn't own any. So they borrowed them from nearby railroads, and they ran them back and forth in various combinations. The test culminated with something like 7 locomotives fully loaded, coupled together, going back and forth over the bridge. And they would measure how much the arches deflected, how much they came down, and they were very, very pleased with the results. So they knew the bridge was safe, but then there was one other test that they thought was worth trying, and they borrowed an elephant, and they started the elephant walking across the bridge. And the theory of this actually made some sense in the minds of the folks of that era. It wasn't that they worried about the weight of the elephant. They thought elephants were wise. And it was well known at the time that elephants were so wise that they would never walk onto an unsafe structure. So they were counting on the elephant's wisdom, not his pounds. And the elephant saw no problem with this bridge, ambled over to Illinois, saw nothing much to like, turned around and came back. So,
Elephant approved.
Yes, exactly. Elephant approval.
Time is short. I wish we had more to discuss all of the details. I really wanted to talk about the tornado and the flooding and all the mishaps, but people can read the book for that, of course, too. So just by way of wrapping up, what would you say is the legacy of James Eads?
What a great question. The modern city of St. Louis we owe to James Eads. Imagine if the bridge had failed. Imagine if St. Louis had not joined the railway age. The city grew from number 6 to number 4 by rank of population between 1880 and 1900. That's Eads. That's his bridge, which is literally making the city join the railway age. So in that sense, that's one direct legacy. I think another interesting legacy is he shows you the power of the mind, the power of imagination, the power of thinking anew and looking for a fresh solution to a problem. Engineering is fundamentally about creativity. It's sometimes hard to see that with all the calculus and the material science, but it's true. The great engineering to this day is creativity at its core, and that's really the lesson of Eads, and that's a lesson that just endures again and again and again.
Well, it's a fascinating read, spanning the Gilded Age is the book, and this is the 150th anniversary of the bridge this year.
150th anniversary of the bridge, and yesterday was James Eads' 204th birthday. So it's a good time to talk about the bridge.
It certainly is, and we appreciate you coming by to talk to us about it. Jan Brown, thanks very much.
Thank you. Great fun.